You are the one who does not enter into any state, who has no mode or condition, who is never active, but who is ever formless being and unmodified, immutable consciousness. If there is a state, if there is activity, you are all that. But in your own essential nature, you have no state, you have no activity, no thought, no doing, no form. Whatever be the state of mind, you yourself appear as all of that. You yourself appear as the experiencer of that state. You appear as the state itself, and then again as if one within the state. This is true of waking, of dreaming, of deep sleep. When waking, when dreaming, when deep asleep, still you ever remain transcendent of all that. You are not that which appears in such states, nor are you actually the experiencer of such states, but you ever remain as pure being, as pure consciousness, which does not wake, which does not dream, which does not sleep. If your own nature is veiled to yourself, you sleep. If your own nature is veiled, plus you imagine, you dream, you wake. The waking one appears as the waking state. The dreaming one appears as the dreaming state. The sleeping one appears as the sleeping state. Once we feel we are in such states, in any of the modes of those states, such as the various mental modes that one is aware of in the waking state, once we feel we are in those, we naturally strive for liberation. And consider liberation a state beyond those modes. Then further, a state beyond these three states of waking, dreaming, and sleep. But actually, liberation is the very nature of your being. That being which is never in any other state, which has no state of its own, but just is existent, without change, without condition, and certainly without any limitation. When we inquire, according to the Maharshi's instruction, who am I? We cease to regard ourselves as having any of the attributes of those modes of mind. We cease to regard ourselves as being one who appears within those states, such as waking or dreaming. We cease to regard ourselves as even being an experiencer of such states, such as a waking experiencer, a dreaming experiencer, a sleeping experiencer. For what you are in your own nature is not an experiencer of anything. You are not the individual or ego, whether appearing heavily defined as a body with attributes, personality, and what have you, or more vaguely defined as one who passes through these states, experiencing various modes of mind. All of that pertains to the individual. But being is absolute. The self is no individual. This self, which is not an individual, is certainly not embodied, is who in truth, what in truth you are. It is delusion to imagine otherwise. To inquire, who am I, is to resolve or dissolve that delusion. As long as you consider yourself to be an individual, there will be some kind of state. And within that state, innumerable experiences corresponding to the quality of that state. But when you inquire and know yourself, and abandon the false sense of individuality, you find that you are never in any state. Inquiring, for whom is this experience? For whom is this state of mind? We find that we are not the individual, not the experiencer, for whom that state supposedly pertains. So then, while one may commence a practice feeling, I am in this state, a state of samsara, and aim for the state of liberation. Or further still, I am waking and dreaming and sleeping, but I am aiming for a state sometimes called the fourth turiya. Really, the nature of that turiya, or fourth, is you yourself. And if you abandon the false supposition that you are an experiencer, an individualized being who has any of these things, you find that liberation is your own nature. That is, you are eternally free and have never been bound. You are always unembodied. You have never been born. You are always free from thought. You have never been conceived. Cease to misidentify, and in self-knowledge, just see what state is yours? If at any point this morning you have a question, or you wish to relate your own experience, feel free to ask or to speak.
You spoke this morning of an experience, an experiencer, and the experiencer is not I. As I was reflecting now back on the Gita and continuing to read Ramana's talks, in the Gita they talked about the field and the knower of the field. What you have said about the experiencer makes me see the experiencer still as the field. Ramana, in something I was reading in the last week, as Ramana was talking about that, he also equated the knower of the field with the witness. And so, of course, then deeper than the knower of the field is the self.
In relation to the field of experience, the self is known as the knower of the field.
In relation. Mm-hmm.
Understanding its immovable, ever-shining nature, it is referred to as the witness. When all false notions of objectivity are cast aside, the self is just as it is. If the self is not known as it is, it appears as I. As soon as there is I, there will be something for it, this. And then the attributes of this will be superimposed back on the I. The knower of the field being defined by the field, by the known, such as illusion. Then again, with I and this, more multiplicity will sprout up. And though you are the knower of the field, you will appear as if you're an entity within the field. Just as in a dream, you are the knower of the dream, yet you appear as if someone in the dream. What has happened? First, your own nature has been veiled, so there was sleep. With sleep came the potential to imagine. You imagined I, this, the dreamer and his dream. Then the dreamer appears as if in the dream, endowed with the false attributes of the dream. It is all you, but really you're none of that.
recently we talked about this, but I would like some further clarification on intention. My job requires intense intention or focus for results. So I've had the grace of experiencing no worry about results recently. It's like a wonderful experience to not have that. So along with that, it seemed like there's a diminishment of the intention, something like a relaxing of intention. However, the job still requires the intention. So how to have that intention without identification with the doer, as being a doer.
How do you connect the two?
It seems
If
like
you
when
have the thought that the work needs to be performed, it must be performed with a certain intensity.
right.
How does that connect for you in your mind with taking up the misidentification of being the performer of the action?
Well, it seems like sometimes when there's an intense focus on results, that it's somehow easy to get identified with the body as the one that's doing it, or the mind that's thinking it, or wanting the objective result, and to get caught up in that identification without being to have that ability to witness it. Sometimes you get identified as like, I'm doing it, I'm accomplishing it.
Are you?
The body-mind seems to be accomplishing it.
Are you the body and the mind?
No.
So then where does the doership come in? Where does the I am the body notion come in?
With the identification of the body-mind, in the intensity of the act of performing that which accomplishes results.
The assumption is that work performed intensely leads to more misidentification than work performed in a more relaxed or even lackadaisical manner. Do outer
Or like
situations,
no action. Or like
do
no
outer
action.
situations, or no action whatsoever?
Right.
Do outer circumstances, including the activities of the body, create our bondage?
Just
Is
the
ignorance a
identification with it
Does it? Do activities produce such ignorance? Misidentification is just ignorance.
Right.
It's not a physical thing. Do physical things, such as activities or the rate of activity or the mental attention we have to give to an activity, do these things create the ignorance of misidentifying? If we think they do, we will be in search, perhaps endlessly so, of the right arrangement of objects, activities, people, and similar things, so that we can be free. If, however, ignorance is self-produced and not produced by outer circumstances, and we further recognize that the whole idea that there is existing outer circumstances is also part of that ignorance, then we are quite free to be free. Do you understand the discrimination being shown?
Yeah, it seems like once I had the realization that, okay, I had this sense of detachment or freedom from the bondage of having to have results, or that identification with that. Once I realized that good feeling, that freedom that I was feeling with that, then I immediately began to see that my activity was not who I was. I was more free to be involved in intense activity without that identification.
Right.
So it seems to be shifting slowly, but I was just wanting more help and further clarification.
Go on discerning,
Yeah.
just as we've been speaking of. Be very clear in your understanding that illusion is born of delusion. That is, one's own ignorance is self-conjured, and outer circumstances, including bodily activities, do not produce it.
Okay.
If you're quite clear about that, then you have the opportunity to inquire, to know yourself all the time. You are the same one whether your body is working intensely or slowly and is on vacation. You are the same self whether your mind has to attend to some detail of work at hand or is free to just roam about where it wishes, you're still the same self. That self ought to know itself and abide as itself, without there being any confusion of yourself with the instruments of the body and mind, which are relatively inert.
And sometimes in relation to what you're saying, when the conditions seem to be working right, then I have a tendency not to inquire as much, but to instead have a reliance on the outer, as if that is my provider and my sustenance. However, when difficulties come, and I find I have more of a tendency to turn within, inquire more, and identify more with self. So what I'm discovering is to alert myself that when things are going well and circumstances are working right, to maintain the same intensity of inquiry, because there's almost like a laziness there that happens otherwise.
That's like saying that one prays to God only when everything is in a state of total calamity.
Yeah,
when all else fails, pray to God.
Right. It's like someone said, you mean it's come to that, we have to pray? It's like that sort of laziness that comes, or that ignorance of that outer dependency falls back into that trap.
When we depend on outer circumstances to provide us with our peace and our happiness, we're just creating our own bondage, aren't we?
So like there's a recommitment on my part to not allow myself to fall into that trap of that identification when things are working as I think they should, or as the world says it should work.
Look closely. Does the thought, things are working out well, now it's time to misidentify, does that thought actually occur to you?
No, it's more subtle than that.
That doesn't really happen, does it? The misidentification really has nothing to do with whether things are going well or not. It is really unrelated to even the mental cognition things are going well or not. It is possible to recognize that things are going well in your activities without misidentifying and without considering those things to be the source of your happiness, without being attached. Right. Just as it's easy for you to recognize things are not going well and need attending to, and still remain unidentified, unattached. If you're unidentified and unattached, you remain in the bliss of your own nature, whether things are going well or not, whether working quickly or slowly, intensely or taking it easy. If you're misidentified and you're attached, you suffer regardless of the circumstances. If you're disidentified and detached, you do not suffer regardless of the circumstances. Therefore, you don't have to, if you understand this, you don't have to watch out that when things get smooth, that you're going to fall into ignorance. No more than when things are going poorly do you need to watch out that you're going to fall into ignorance. Once you know where happiness is, and you know the direction to inquire, who am I? It's not so tricky.
Okay, I trust
There's no
you.
balancing act.
This perhaps is related to what Sheila was talking about, and again, more of what I've gotten from the Gita. In the last chapter of the Gita, when he was talking about action, then Shankara very clearly, at least for me, pointed out the kind of triad of action, of the action, the agent of action, and the results of action. And to me, that was very useful because I see in my own identification with misidentification with action, in fact, this results of action are for me very much where the ego identification shows up. And it's been useful to look at that side of action and see that the results of action are not for me either. So then again, when I act, it doesn't matter if it's a good day or a bad day. The good day or bad day just has to do with the results of action and the confusion about for whom are those.
If you are the doer of action, you reap the results. If you're not the doer, if you're not the actor, then the results are not for you. Shankara has pointed out very clearly in the commentary how knowledge is for you, your own nature. And knowledge is the very substance of liberation and of reality. Action pertains to an illusory actor, and illusory objects are the fruits of his action. If we throw ourselves into the delusion of considering ourselves to be enmeshed in that, then as the Maharshi points out in Upadesha Saram, the engagement in action just throws one into a whole ocean of action with no end in sight. But you're not the body. You're not the actor. Your true concern should just be about what you are. Always you are. If we just rest in what that are is, everything's fine. As often as one misidentifies and looks past that essential being and imagines oneself to be something else, just so often we should inquire.
As I inquire deeply, there's just a very simple but obvious revelation of a mistake I make. I think I'm something other than what I am. And just knowing that sort of clears up the whole mess. And the mess gets smaller and smaller and smaller. It just sort of recedes. The whole reality that it's actually there disappears. And the question I have is, it's like an obvious question. It's like, did that ever really happen? Because it seems like in knowing that, that's like that sort of kills the ego. But it seems to me that it requires that I continually know that. It's not something that, or maybe I have the idea that if I can just get it once finally, deep enough. But then I ask, well, who is it that thinks who's making up that, like that rule or that plan? Then that question goes away.
Mm-hmm. You're right in as much as you know ignorance as ignorance, it ceases to exist, it diminishes to the nil point. Both approaches are right when you say, I need to know this continuously. I need to know it once and for all. They're both right. If we inquire as to who it is who presently regards himself as not knowing this continuously, as if he were one thing, and the self to be continuously known is something else, or the one who does not know it deeply enough, as if he stood outside his own nature and did not comprehend it, if we would deeply inquire into him, the illusion swallows itself up. To say that an illusion ever occurred is as illusory as the illusion itself.
Yeah, you can't make up an illusion and say that it was real at some point.
Then you would not regard it as an illusion.
No. It's like I'll just say it. If it appears to get started, I can always find where it started from. And when I find that spot, then it didn't start.
Every illusion of whatever kind will trace its starting point to I, as Sri Bhagavan has pointed out. However, if we inquire as to what the I is, there's no individual. There's no point. Not so much as even a doubt. Even the abstract conception of it is not there.
Yeah, as you kept making it smaller and smaller, I kept trying to, trace it back, and then it just wasn't there a funny? There is no there.
Getting better acquainted again with my being, that's where my happiness is. It's where I feel like I can rest. And if you could help me get clear, like in your discourse when you were talking about the states and how there's veiling. And in my meditation, sometimes or my lack of meditation, I experience the veiling. And then I feel like there's a misidentification, either with the confusion that goes along with that. And either the inquiry doesn't happen, or it doesn't feel as penetrating as it could be. And how can I resolve that more directly?
In what state do you wish to be?
A state of happiness, freedom all the time.
Is there anything obstructing that freedom or happiness?
Well, it's sort of like the 10th man. The 10th man's always there, but sometimes he doesn't recognize it.
What prevents the recognition? What obstructs it? What makes up the veil?
If I don't persist in finding finding out who's experiencing or doing. If I find myself reacting rather than inquiring for whom is this.
So lack of inquiry means a veil, and from that veil, a projecting of all kinds of division, all kinds of problems. But if you inquire, the divisions get swallowed up or burned up, and the veil also gets incinerated. Is that your experience?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So what do you need to know?
Well, I don't need to know anything. No, actually, well, it's more like what I need to know is who I am. That's what I need to know.
So you need to know who you are, you need to inquire consistently and deeply.
Mm-hmm.
If you know that much, apply yourself. Be diligent, be persevering.
Yesterday I read this quote of Maharishi's that was on the cards that I was doing, and I can't remember the exact words, but it said, with untroubled mind, look to where the source of life is and realize the self, something along those lines. I think it happened. And I went back next door and I was thinking about this quote, and there was a part of it that I could see you could really overlook fast. And so I wanted to have you talk about that part of it, or the whole thing. The part that went deep for me was the part of untroubled mind, what that really means. And it was wonderful, actually, because it was seemed to bypass any idea in the moment of meditating of the personality or the doer or any misidentification one might have of the self, small self. And then the rest of the quotes sort of followed through from that. It was like that was the key that unlocked the whole there was also an element, looking back on it, that involved faith or trust that you've talked about before. Anyway, it was a great card, great quote to meditate on right then.
The quotation is from the 5 verses on the self, 5 verses to Arunachala, excuse me. The Arunachala Pancharatnam. And yes, it says something to the effect that he who dives inward or turns inward with untroubled mind to search where the consciousness of I arises, realizes the self. Untroubled mind is important.
Yeah.
What is an untroubled mind? That is more or less the question you've raised. A mind that is not caught up with egotism, becomes untroubled. Egotism is not only when one is haughty and stuck up and arrogant or this kind of thing. Egotism can manifest with the opposite attributes. That is, thinking poorly of oneself, depressed about oneself. It's still all about one's so-called self. A troubled mind is one that whirls around this egotism. An untroubled mind is one that is turned inward. An untroubled mind is one that is based upon something much more solid than egotism. It's based upon something absolute. This doesn't mean that one has necessarily realized the absolute yet, otherwise the rest of the verse wouldn't follow, nor all the verses put together. But turning inward with untroubled mind, does it not signify turning inward, that one's known where happiness and peace really lie? Why does someone turn inward? Only if he or she knows in this way lies peace, in this way lies happiness. Inward also has a deeper connotation. What is truly inward is non-objective. What is non-objective is not a product of our body and senses and our thinking. Our thinking about things, that may be subtle, but not inward. Inward is when we go beyond our thinking about things, and certainly beyond our senses and beyond our activities. When you know where happiness is to be found, that it is to be found inward, and you intend to take an inward direction, you become detached from outer things, and therefore you're untroubled by them. Because the life is based upon something absolute, rather than whirling around in the narrow confines within the small bubble of egotism. It is untroubled, not tossed around by wild cravings, fears, and what have you. So turning inward, having an untroubled mind, a not worldly mind, a not egotistically minded mind. Turning inward means to try to find that which is the withinness itself. What lies at the core is I. So he says to search where the consciousness of I arises. That is the sense or notion, I. From where does it rise? If we find that out, the self will be realized. I will rise no more, and even the mind will cease to exist. But its troubles are long gone by then. You might find it useful to read the whole set of the 5 verses, Dharanacha. There's only 5 of them, but they're very profound.
Two things, actually. One, I was kind of thinking about that Friday night, Ramana Darshan, and meditating on the source. I've been having a good time doing that. And the other question I had was on the, I guess the answer to Shiva that you were giving about finding versus the good and the bad, you know, finding that place of happiness, because it seems like that any time the mind goes outward, is an outward-going mind, which leads to mischief, which leads to suffering, maybe pretty quickly. So even, when my mind goes outward for the good stuff.
The good stuff.
It really isn't that good. It's pretty dry out there.
Mm-hmm. When you have the idea of good stuff, what makes it good?
The ultimate, gathering of happiness externally somehow. It's
Okay.
not really quite sure how it's going to get it there.
But the belief that it's good comes from you, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Likewise, the happiness.
Yeah.
So is there anything good?
Yeah. Comes from me. And I guess goes back to my first question, the source.
Where the good stuff lies.
Because it seems like if my mind is rattling, knocking around with some outward going tendency, it seems good to kind of take it back to that source. That was really cool meditation. I'm glad we covered that on Friday night. And recognizing, I guess, that source is the actual thoughts and desires, just like what you're just talking about. That source is really where it all springs from.
The stuff and the desire for the stuff springs from your own mind, doesn't it? According to your state of mind, there are the objects and the desires or the other kinds of relation with those objects. For example, when you're in deep sleep, where's your desire then?
It seems like the desire is gone. I mean, it's not outward.
But you're not unhappy.
Right. There's no drive to go outward at that point.
Why is there no drive to go outward?
There's no belief in external reality or happiness.
There's no belief in an external reality, so there's no outward. There's the happiness of your own nature already present, so no desire. And you are not taking up the position of being a waking state experiencer, some kind of embodied being. Since that definition is not there, the objective definition, the world, is not there. Since neither the subject nor the object are there, the relation between them, desire or otherwise, is not there. But you are there. And your happiness is there, without anything else. Knowing this, what kind of rattling can you engage in?
There's no rattling to be had in itself. Nothing to rattle against. There's nothing.
So no snake, no rattle.
Well, the things that make the rattling sound are the thoughts.
But since the snake himself has not been born, his rattles are not there either.
It's amazing.
Remain firm in the knowledge of what you are. Not awake, not dreaming, not sleeping. Not missing anything. Just formless, space-like consciousness. That's perfect, that's full, always.
Seems like it comes, and you mentioned this in your discourse, and I don't remember the exact words, but essentially if you take yourself to be there as an ego entity, or then you're going to have some state. Right? You're going to be in a state. So from a state, you're going to have, sure enough, you're going to spring out everything else. So.
Once you have the state, then you'll appear within it as some sort of body or form. You will also appear in it as the objects of the world of that state. Then there'll be endless modes of interaction. But none of that's true about you.
But yeah, the questioning of the one to have that state. And you know, this is also something, I guess, was a good meditation from Friday night, was the discussion about the body, you know, how the Maharshi was taking down the body, thoughts. Because, you know, I asked that question.
And the I.
And the I.
Both ways.
Yeah. So I've been just continuing in that, looking for the source, to look for the source of that I. At least trying.
If we look to the source of I, we find that which is truly I. But then it's no longer a source because nothing has come out of it. As long as the real self seems to have lent its identity to something else, you should search out the source of the I within you. The way is subjective, not objective.
Yeah. Well,
But your being in reality is not a source. A source is where there's two.
yeah, so it's important, I guess, for the meditation to feel that way, where, and it seems more obvious because, you know, the rattling is two. So if the rattling kind of vaporizes, that's clear, because then it's like the mind clears up.
With the destruction of ignorance, the attributes of delusion also vanish. The attributes of the delusion are any kinds of suffering, any feeling of limitation, any kind of bondage. If we eliminate the ignorance, the attributes of that ignorance are gone. So all that is necessary is you to remain very steady in the certain knowledge of who you are. And since there are not two of you, steadiness should not be difficult.
It's interesting. So it shouldn't be difficult.
How can there be difficulty when there are not two of you?
Yeah, it seems I don't know, easier definitely here, speaking about it. Just like,
Then remain here always.
Okay. So it's just the outward projection that would ever make it seem difficult.
With no conception of difficulty, abandon the outer projection and the veiling of your own nature. Remain in the certain knowledge of who you are. Who would project what? Where?
यस्येच्छा विद्यते काचित् स सिद्धिं साधयत्ययो निरच्छो परिपूर्णस्य नेच्छा सम्भवति क्वचित्.
For whom there is desire existing, there is the acquisition of miraculous powers, alas. For one in whom there is no desire, no seeking, who is completely, perfectly full, no desire exists whatsoever.
Sarvechhajalasam shantha avatmalabho bhavonmunim sakadham siddhijalani kadham vanchatya chittakaha.
When the net, deception, of all desires becomes completely peaceful, extinguished, the self will be gained, O sage. How can he be in the snares of miraculous power? How can one with no mind go astray?
Api shitaruchavarke sutikshne pindu mandale apadhya prasaratyagno jivan mukto na vismayi.
Though the brilliant sun would shine down cold, though the orb of the sun, the moon, the radiance of fire, though fire would spread downward, the one liberated in life, Jivan Mukta, would not feel amazed.
Adhishtane pare tattve kalpita rajju sarpavat kalpitascharya jaleshu nabhyute kutuhalam.
The assumed is on the basis of the supreme truth, like the rope snake. There is no moving toward wandering in the assumed illusion or arousing of curiosity because of an extraordinary matter.
Yehi vijñāta vijñēya vitaraga mahadhiyaha vichinna grantayas salve te swatantratāstanau sthitaha.
Certainly, those who have known what is to be known, with passions gone, who are of great intellect, whose knots of the heart have been cut asunder, in all of them there is the abidance in freedom, or whose knots are cut asunder, in all of them there is the freedom of abidance in the heart.
सुखदुःखदशाधीरं साम्यान्न प्रोद्धरन्ति यं निश्चासा इव शैलेन्द्रं चित्तं तस्य मृतं विदुः.
The mind of him that remains in equanimity in the conditions of happiness and sorrow, which they do not disturb, even as the Lord of mountains by a sigh, the wise know as dead.
Apat karpanyamutsaho mado mandyam mahotsavaha yam nayanti na vairupyam tasya nashtam mano viduhu.
The mind of him that is not led into differences, diversity, multiplicity of form, by misfortune, calamity, poverty, weakness, power, strength, energy, acceleration, hilarity, intoxication, sexual enjoyment, weakness, slowness, a feeble mind, or great rejoicing, a great festival, the wise know as destroyed.
द्विविधश्चित्तनाशोऽस्ति सरूपो रूप एव च जीवन्मुक्तौ स्वरूपः स्यात् अरूपो देहमुक्तिगः.
The destruction of the mind is of two kinds, with form and without form. In liberation in life, Jivamukta, it is with form, and it shall be formless upon moving to liberation from the body.
Chitta satteha dukkhaya chitta nasha sukhaya cha chitta sattam kshayam nitva chittam nashamupanayet.
Here the existence of the mind for suffering and the destruction of the mind is for happiness. Having brought the mind's existence to diminution, the mind is brought near to destruction.
मनस्तां मूढदां विद्धि यदा नश्यति सा नघा चित्तनाशाभिधानं हि तत्स्वरूपम् इतीरितम्.
Know that mind is confusion, foolishness, bewilderment, ignorance. When it vanishes, it is named the destruction of mind, and certainly that is thus said to be the true nature.